Next Friday, a classic detective returns to ITV, Columbo and the case of the dagger in the mind.
Willful murder by some person or persons unknown.
The first ever Agatha Christie novel and the birth of a new detective.
He's a funny little man. A great dandy.
Mon Dieu! If I'm not greatly mistaken, he's got something up his sleeve.
Something that connected the murderer with the crime.
The mysterious affair at Styles on the centenary weekend of Agatha Christie's birth.
Alfred Inglethorpe must not be arrested, Superintendent. That I have sworn.
Sunday, 7:45.
Paradise at the end of the American road. New West, the new skin scent for men by Aramis. Now available at selected stores.
I wouldn't do that if I were you, Rupert.
If the wind changes, you'll stay like it.
Well, I'd get rid of him, love.
You hang on to him, he's all right.
I think you should make a nice cup of tea.
It seems that everyone in the world has plenty of advice to give.
Take the money away for the box. 19 pounds. She's going to take the money. Oh!
The question is, which is the right advice? And where can you go to get it?
Oh, no, please, there's something in my eye.
Try pulling your eyelid down as far as it'll go.
And then blowing your nose.
I wouldn't pull that trigger if I were you.
At the Halifax, we've probably given more advice on mortgages than any other lender. With all that experience and our wide range of plans and options, we believe we can give you the best advice on your mortgage.
Try pulling your eyelid down as far as it'll go.
Then blowing your nose.
The Halifax, for mortgage advice you can bank on.
I'll see you in court.
Just remember that you're shopping at a store that is stocking an amazing 60,000 sweets a year, that sells a different item every second, so it's reckoned. Tables, chairs and loads of other mind-expanding gear. The merchandise you see is of the highest quality at prices that are sure to suit all sorts. So if you're craving carpets, picking pine or buying beds, then I sincerely hope to see you all in court.
It comes every day. I just can't guarantee when. It's a temperamental ghost. You're not the Headless Baron.
No, I'm from Barclays. I think I may be able to help.
Yes, I think you might.
You see, with an unreliable ghost, it may be better to offer weekend breaks rather than hourly visits. And with a flexible loan, you could develop accommodation and even catering.
Let's discuss this in my office.
If you're running a small business or thinking of starting one, talk to Barclays.
A true Hollywood legend. Steve McQueen, Saturday at 9 on Channel 4.
You know where to reach me.
Tonight, the London programme exposes the failings of the infertility business and asks what can be done to protect patients. The London programme at 10:45. You're watching London Weekend Television. Now, today's international news at 10 o'clock.
Sends up to 8,000 men and tanks to the Gulf. Mr. King says they're to tell President Saddam he will lose. President Bush calls the news the icing on the cake. The Iraqis refuse to release a Briton dying of cancer. And inflation goes over 10.5%. Good evening. Britain announced today it's sending up to 8,000 troops and 120 tanks to Saudi Arabia. It is Britain's biggest deployment of armour since the Second World War. The Defence Secretary, Mr. Tom King, said President Saddam Hussein of Iraq must be made to realise that one way or another he will lose. Britain is sending the 7th Armoured Brigade, the Desert Rats, based in West Germany. Up to 5,000 men are committed, another 3,000 are available. Also going, 120 Challenger tanks. The cost of British forces in the Gulf will double to £2 million a day, and it will add 4% to the annual cost of Britain's defence bill.
This is a massive British commitment, not just the biggest armour deployment since the Second World War, but a sixth of the army on the Rhine. The tanks, the thousands of troops, the guns and the armoured vehicles will be ferried to Saudi Arabia to show we're prepared to stand in the front line alongside the Americans and to take a message to Saddam Hussein.
While we seek the implementation of United Nations resolutions by peaceful means, other options remain available, and that one way or another he will lose. Iraq's evil aggression must be reversed.
It's not yet clear how the bill for the tanks will be paid.
We estimate that these further deployments will increase the operating cost to £2 million a day and a capital spend of something over £100 million.
That seems to blow a hole in the plans of Treasury ministers to cut defence spending. Keeping the forces there for 6 months will cost £500 million. The ministers who gathered at Downing Street this morning knew sending tanks was going to be not only expensive, but difficult and time-consuming. The tanks won't be fully operational before November. But whatever the cost, the problems or the dangers, the judgment is this is a political necessity. The government hope remains that as the ring of military steel tightens around him, Saddam Hussein will give in.
I think that the announcements I've made today, the announcements made by other countries, the forces that they're prepared to commit, all add to the pressure that if there is any remaining sense in Baghdad, they'll realize that they've now taken on more than they can actually handle. And I think there's the best possible chance of seeing this resolved by peaceful means.
So Mrs. Thatcher fulfills the pledge she made in the Commons to send more forces to the Gulf, and she has sent precisely what the Americans requested. As in that debate, the other political parties are prepared to back her in this decision.
Tanks, I think, would have been seen on their own as a purely symbolic gesture. Sending an armoured division, creating the deployment of a formation which is self-sufficient and well supported is, I think, likely to give a much clearer signal to Saddam Hussein.
Although Labour sees the force only as defensive.
I think that since Saudi Arabia has invited us, together with a considerable number of other countries, it's right that we should make our contribution towards making sure that Saddam Hussein doesn't try to invade Saudi Arabia.
The government is not prepared, however, to limit the use of these tanks to defence. The whole point of their deployment is that they can be used to attack, and hence they increase the pressure on Saddam Hussein. When they do set sail, it will stir memories of the Falklands. The hope is that this time they can win a war without firing a shot, but the force being prepared is one which is ready for a battle which would be far more bloody than the Falklands.
Most of the equipment will be moved by sea, a journey which will take at least 3 weeks. But work will first have to be carried out to prepare the tanks for the desert. It could be several weeks before they're ready to leave.
The Desert Rats could be in action again. The successors to the World War II 7th Armoured Division, which fought in North Africa, have been picked to go to Saudi Arabia. In many cases, sons will be following in their father's footsteps. Today they're equipped with the Challenger main battle tank, considered by most experts to be the equal of any because of its Chobham armour, which is widely thought to be the best protection in the world. Experts are convinced it will do well in the desert.
Well, it's been thoroughly tested in the desert. It was originally designed for the Iranians with desert operations in mind, and it was assessed as a candidate tank for the Saudis. It's been thoroughly tested in the desert.
The initial deployment will involve around 5,000 men, though this could rise to 8,000. 2 armoured regiments with 120 Challengers are the most substantial force. Normally, the brigade is also composed of an armoured infantry battalion with 45 Warrior infantry fighting vehicles, an armoured recce squadron equipped with 16 Scimitar light tanks, an artillery regiment with 24 155mm self-propelled guns, an air defence battery with 36 Javelin missile units, and an Army Air Corps squadron of 9 Lynx and 4 Gazelle reconnaissance helicopters. In addition, another squadron of ground attack Tornadoes, equipped for day or nighttime reconnaissance, and a half squadron of 6 Tornado air defence fighters are being sent. The units involved are the Queen's Dragoon Guards, the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars, the 40 Field Regiment Royal Artillery and the Staffordshire Regiment. But is this enough to demonstrate British determination to the Iraqis?
Anything less would not have been. I think one has to say that. A single unit would not have been. But an armoured brigade, such as this is, with all the power that goes with that, manned by regular soldiers, highly professional chaps, is undoubtedly a body that will add weight to what is already there and will show Saddam Hussein that we are not simply operating with words but with deeds.
But as the Americans have discovered, shipping tanks to Saudi Arabia is fraught with difficulties. They've suffered delays because of mechanical problems with ships. As in the Falklands, the Ministry of Defence will charter civilian vessels to transport heavy war materials. Supply routes will be long. The M109 self-propelled gun can share American ammunition, but Challenger can't. And American, Saudi and British armour will still be heavily outnumbered by Iraqi tanks.
American and Australian warships fired warning shots across the bows of an Iraqi tanker in the Gulf of Oman after its captain refused to stop. The vessel was allowed to continue its journey when a boarding party found it was empty. In America, President Bush welcomed Britain's deployment of ground troops and tanks. He said it was the icing on the cake.
President Bush, heading for his weekend retreat at Camp David, said the USS Bruton was acting in support of UN sanctions policy when it fired shots across the Iraqi tanker's bows.
Yes, American vessel did, in accordance with the United Nations resolutions, in accordance with the sanctions, cause another Iraqi vessel to heave to, and it has been boarded. It did require a bit of a warning before the captain pulled over and permitted the boarding party to have a look.
US tanks were also firing today, live rounds for the first time in the Saudi desert. The news that they were to be joined by British tanks drew nostalgic praise from Mr. Bush.
Some Americans may remember the name the Desert Rats, and that's who will be going. As I told the Prime Minister over the phone, given all that the United Kingdom is already doing, this truly comes as the icing on the cake, a significant move by the Brits.
But defence analysts here see an even greater significance in the British deployment.
That if this comes to war, people aren't going to be able to back up and let the Americans take the Iraqis out of Kuwait. This has really got to be a lot of different countries fighting Iraq, not just the Americans.
With the United Nations last night backing America's tough line on humanitarian aid to Iraq and Kuwait, and confirmation of additional financial support from the Japanese, Mr. Bush begins his weekend with things going very much his way. Alistair Stewart, News at 10, Washington.
Army commanders are now checking the 7th Brigade's combat units to find the best vehicles available for the Gulf. Most of the tanks will come from the brigade's base at Fallingbostel in West Germany, where soldiers and equipment are preparing for desert conditions.
The men are proud to be known as the new Desert Rats. The famous badge is everywhere. And by the gate is a World War II Sherman tank in which the original Desert Rats fought their way across North Africa, including the territory now known as Iraq. It was just this afternoon that the men had their first briefing confirming they are going to Saudi Arabia and outlining the massive preparations ahead. And there were warnings about the need for tight security.
Don't say anything, right? Just let them film, don't let them in come.
Although they knew there was a possibility they'd be sent to the Gulf, it wasn't until the announcement this afternoon that the brigade's officers could get down to the detailed planning of moving 6,000 men and 120 tanks to the Middle East. The Union flag was ceremonially lowered this evening in Germany. In a few weeks, it'll be flying over a base in the desert. Sarah Cullen, News at 10, with the Desert Rats.
American soldiers in Saudi Arabia say they'll welcome the British troops with open arms. The 7th Armoured Brigade will get American intelligence briefings. The latest indicate weak spots in Iraq's frontline force.
The Americans call it Dinosaur Valley, a barren wasteland in the middle of the Saudi desert,
chosen as an ideal training ground for tanks. The US Army is already here. Its M1 tanks are acclimatizing before they're moved nearer the front. Before the end of next month, they'll be joined by 120 British Challenger tanks from the 7th Armoured Brigade. In Dinosaur Valley, dust and heat are the first enemies the British must face, but the Americans say they can't wait for their allies to arrive.
They'll be welcomed with open arms from the American soldiers, I guarantee them that. We're looking forward to them coming out here.
Darn glad to see them get here. The British Army has a great reputation for discipline, and discipline is what's going to win battles for us.
This is one drill British soldiers will soon be familiar with. The Americans today practicing the procedure for decontaminating vehicles after a chemical attack.
There's reassuring news for the British forces coming out here. The Americans have just completed an evaluation of the Iraqi armour and artillery they could be facing. It highlights key weaknesses: an inability to fight efficiently at night, older and more vulnerable equipment, and poor lines of supply and communication.
The British Army is already represented in Operation Desert Shield. Sergeant Stephen Bardsley, a Falklands veteran, on attachment to the 82nd Airborne, giving young American soldiers the benefit of his experience.
I enjoy working with the Americans. Basically, they've had to bend to my way of thinking. I haven't gone to their way of thinking. The basic principle is they bend to my way of thinking or I break their backs. It's as simple as that.
Meanwhile, the armoured divisions of the multinational force have now moved one stage closer to being prepared for confrontation. After earlier objections, their Saudi Arabian hosts are now allowing American troops and armour to practice with real ammunition. Paul Davis, News at 10, Saudi Arabia.
France threatened to retaliate tonight after Iraqi troops forced their way into the French embassy in Kuwait City and seized 4 French citizens. One of the 4, a diplomat, was later released. It was the most serious of 3 similar incidents today. Troops also entered Canadian and Belgian diplomatic buildings.
It's now 3 weeks since embassies in Kuwait were declared closed by the Iraqi authorities. America's diplomats have managed to hold on, so have the 4 staff held up in the British embassy. But the latest moves, the Iraqis for the first time entering diplomatic territory, mark a significant escalation in the pressure. The Foreign Office has managed to establish that early reports of an Iraqi break-in to the British compound were incorrect. Similar reports about the American embassy have also been discounted. The action against the French was taken not at the embassy itself, but at the ambassador's residence. Of the 4 French seized by the Iraqis, 1 was a diplomat and was later released. The Dutch were also harassed by Iraqi troops who broke in and told them to take down a national flag, and 2 Belgian diplomats were threatened. The Foreign Office Minister, William Waldegrave, called it a grave step.
This is another step in the series of illegal steps in breach of all the Geneva and Vienna conventions that the Iraqis have taken.
The French have protested to Iraq. President Mitterrand told a press conference this afternoon that he's called an emergency meeting of his crisis cabinet for tomorrow morning. If he has new diplomatic pressure in mind, it's likely to be coordinated through the European community. EC foreign ministers will discuss the embassy war when they meet in Brussels on Monday.
A British man with cancer who was ordered off a flight home from Kuwait has been told he can't leave Iraq because the Iraqis claim he's been cured. Tony Wilbraham has joined other Western hostages in a Baghdad hotel. His wife Maureen refuses to leave without him.
Tony Wilbraham, seen here on holiday in Florida 3 months ago, was told by doctors in England at the beginning of the year that he was dying of lung cancer. He and his wife Maureen, who've lived in Kuwait for 11 years, hoped his condition would persuade the Iraqis to let him go. But Iraqi doctors now say Tony has been cured and must stay. His wife says he's still terminally ill and should be allowed to go.
He looks well. My husband always looks well. Even when he was having his treatment, he looked well. Because he refuses, he absolutely refuses to do anything else but look well. He won't give in. That's why we went back to Kuwait to work. He wanted to go back to Kuwait after the treatment. I think our local doctor was amazed. He couldn't see why he just didn't go on the sick.
Britain's ambassador says his staff are doing all they can.
We are using every method of pressure we can think of to persuade the authorities that now that they've let the women and children go, surely they ought to make exceptions either for the whole category of sick people or people who need constant medication, or at least the most sick of those people. And Mr. Wilbraham, ably supported by a very devoted wife is sort of top of our list for in that category.
Tony's illness was diagnosed at a specialist cancer hospital in Manchester, where doctors have confirmed the seriousness of his condition, although they say he may still look and feel like a fit man. His brother-in-law is sending confidential hospital records to Baghdad to help get his release.
I have contacted this morning his doctor at Christie's, who has prepared a statement, and hopefully at least the Iraqis over here will realise that we are not fooling, that we're not telling fibs, that Tony is a seriously ill man and that we must get him out at any cost.
Tony is now being held at the Monsomelia Hotel in Baghdad. His wife is being forced to stay at another hotel, even though she's now given up her own chance of escape to stay with her dying husband.
The rate of inflation went over 10.5% today, its highest for 8 years. The government said it was not unexpected after the rise in oil prices, a report in Part 2. Also, more black commuters are killed and wounded in South Africa. And Rochdale Council defends its social workers in the satanic abuse case. That's in a couple of minutes.
I put a nickel in the telephone, dial my baby's number, got a busy line. Each time I tried, I got a busy tone, not my baby's number, just a busy line.
Inside the M25, Cellnet is the network with the most available lines. Remember that if you're choosing a mobile phone.
Busy kissing someone else, while I was keeping busy, getting a busy line.
With Cellnet, you're busy, not the phone.
There's a new day dawning. You feel it in the air. The world is growing closer. You see it everywhere.
Cathay Pacific, helping the new world of international travelers arrive in better shape.
There's a new world.
You can't inoculate a child against starvation, but you can inoculate the wheat. We don't actually stick a needle into each seed. That would be ridiculous. At ICI, we coat it, we feed it, and now can even breed resistance into it. World problems, world solutions, world class.
Great.
I see Lung Polly are cutting up to £50 off Florida Walt Disney World holidays.
Get away.
Comet are giving interest-free credit on all of these. You know where to come.
Inflation has risen above 10% to its highest level for more than 8 years. Labour said the figure of 10.6% for August showed that prospects for the British economy were alarming. The Chancellor, John Major, denied inflation was out of control.
Chancellor John Major had already warned that inflation was likely to reach 10% this week, but the figure of 10.6 was even higher than expected and way above what he'd forecast for the autumn in his budget last spring. But the Chancellor denied his policy was in trouble.
We have a short-term problem with inflation. It's one we will cope with. It's one where the economic policies to cope with it are firmly in place. And as we have seen in the last few months with the economic indicators and the real indicators in the economy, we are now seeing a slowdown, and that will lead to a significant drop in inflation.
But the news is psychologically bad for the government because inflation is now higher than when they came to power in May 1979. Then it was 10.1%, but rose to a peak of 21.9 in May 1980. The last time it was over 10% was in March 1982. An all-time low of 2.4 was reached in August 1986, and now it's back up at 10.6%. Labour were quick to point up the comparison with 11 years ago.
Well, we're back where we started after 11 years in which we were promised stable prices, and of course during a decade which has been favourable from the inflation point of view. And could I make it clear that I don't think any of this rate of inflation of any consequence comes from the Gulf crisis. It's a very small element that would be coming from the petrol price increases. This results from the government's failure to manage the economy successfully.
There's no way the Chancellor can blame all this on Saddam Hussein and the hot summer. We knew it was going to go over 10%. It is the consequence of policies pursued by the Conservative government which fed a boom and failed to control inflation.
As today's figures were released, the government were able to put some of the blame on higher oil prices. But the continuing rise in inflation, it's likely to go up again next month, does raise doubts about their economic policies. Jackie Ashley, News at 10, Westminster.
The inflation figure took the city by surprise. It had been expecting something slightly over 10%. The stock market fell sharply on the news, and the FTSE index closed down more than 33 points.
The price of a pint of beer, one of the reasons why British inflation has lurched into double figures. The cost of food and other basic goods also rose sharply last month. Higher inflation wasn't simply the result of the increase in petrol prices. The full impact of the Gulf crisis has not yet